Welcome to Tell Me Exactly, an emergency communications podcast. I'm your host, Meridith Jensen, and today we're telling you exactly what the relevant fire industry standards are and why they matter in emergency communications. On Tell Me Exactly, I invite experts from Priority Dispatch and the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch to talk about all things related to emergency communications centers. Today, I'm joined by Mike Thompson and Jay Dornseif. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
Hi. All right, so let me tell our listeners a little bit about each of you. Mike is the fire protocol academics and standards expert at the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, and he's also a member of the Fire Council of Standards for the IAED. Jay is an implementations manager at Priority Dispatch, and he chairs the Fire Council of Standards Raters Committee for the IAED and is the committee chair for the NFPA 1061. Both of these guys are retired from leadership positions in the fire service. I'm so excited to have both of you here to share your experience and knowledge with me. So Jay, let's start with you. Tell me exactly what we mean when we talk about fire industry standards.
So probably the oldest standard setting body in the fire service is the NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association.
Okay.
They've actually been around since the late 1800s.
No way.
Yeah, that first started out having a standard about how to address fire alarms. Back when you used to go to the pull boxes on the street corners and activate those to tell the fire department that they had a call at that location. So 100 years later, they now write standards for over 300 different levels of fire service, anywhere from training to equipment to fire apparatus, personal protective equipment, and anything that has to deal with the fire service. And so obviously telecommunications is one of those standards within the NFPA organization.
So Jay, be honest. Were you a part of that first group back in the 1800s?
No, I was not. So I joined the 1221 and the 1061 committee over 10 years ago when they set a call processing standard within the standard. And so obviously we were concerned about the call processing standard. And so I joined the committee to find out about how the call processing standard came to be and what we could do to make it better for the communication centers. So we do cycles, used to be every 3 years, now it's every 5 years. And every cycle we refine the standard to hopefully help telecommunication centers to meet the standard, starting with it wasn't all fire calls had to be processed in a rapid time amount. It's now down to just on the fire side, structure fires and explosions. And so obviously that's helped the dispatch centers greatly to try to achieve that standard, but there's still more work to do as it's a one-size-fits-all standard. So it's 60 seconds to process these fire calls, but it just doesn't seem to fit every size and shape of a telecommunications center.
Of course not, right? That we need to make sure that we can customize that and make adjustments to fit the resources that they have available. So you talked about the standard for times for getting the responses going. Are there other parts of the NFPA standards that affect other areas of telecommunications, like training or anything like that?
So the 1061 standard is the standard for professional qualifications for telecommunicators, and so that's where the training standard comes into play for the content and so forth to be a telecommunicator. That's the 1061 side. The 1221 side is call processing that we just talked about, and it's also talks about being certified as a call taker, having a recertification component to that standard, and also having a quality assurance program in place. Okay. That is a requirement to be a fire call processing center.
Right, because if you're going to have these standards in place, it really doesn't make any sense to have them in place if you're not going to do any kind of quality assurance to see if they're being followed, right? Or to measure if those tools and resources that you have available are actually working. Okay. And so then talk to me a little bit about the next one on our list here, the ISO. What is that one?
So the Insurance Standards Organization has always been rating fire departments. Every fire department in the United States has a rating, whether they're volunteer, combination, or fully career fire department. And for the longest time, they had their own rating scale as to what made Class 1 is the best fire department there is out there. And that includes the fire department, the water supply, and the communication center is 10% of that grade. And so in, I believe it was 2014, the ISO was looking to update their standards, and they found out that NFPA, we constantly revise our standards now every 5 years. And so, ours were more relevant than a standard that had been around for a while. So the ISO organization adopted the NFPA standards when it came to grading or rating a communication center as part of the fire department's grade. And so everything that I just mentioned, being certified, recertified, having a quality assurance program in place, gets you points towards the communication center's rating, and the higher the points that the communication center gets, that helps lower the fire department's rating. Class 1 is what everybody strives for. It's very difficult to achieve, as you can imagine, to be a perfect fire department with perfect water supply and a perfect communication center. It is achievable. There are a lot of places that work hard for years and years.
Takes a lot of money.
And a lot of money and time. Mike could probably speak to his department's rating and how that was achieved and so forth. But obviously things changed greatly when they adopted the NFPA standards, and they were using a totally different standard to rate a communication center. And now all of a sudden everybody had to adopt these NFPA standards.
And what's the benefit to an agency or to a fire service to achieving a low ISO rating?
The theory is you pay less in insurance rates. Yeah. That's the theory.
Excellent.
Because
okay.
It's insurance service organization, so that's the theory. But the way that insurance carriers judge risk these days is they've gotten away from the ISO just a little bit. A lot of times what insurance carriers will do now is look at previous history and risk in an area to determine, what people should pay for insurance, instead of maybe just solely how that fire department is rated. If you live in the Southeast, for instance, and there's a lot of hurricanes and they have a lot of floods, you might wind up paying more for insurance even though they have a Class 1 fire department there.
Okay, I see.
And so, it's still important, and it's still important to fire departments, because it's not just about how much money you pay as a homeowner. It's about how well that fire department is prepared to protect that community. They even call it a protection classification score. Yeah. And so, like Jay said, that 10% or those 10 points that they're allowing now for what are happening in communications, that's huge.
Yeah, it can lower a fire department an entire scale. So it's 1 through 10, and it's every 10 points. So actually, to be a Class 1, you have to have a good score from the communication center.
So you have 50, 40, and 10. That's right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Plus you get another 5% for
fire prevention and things like
that.
Yeah,
okay.
5%. So you get 105%.
Point, yes, a lot of insurance companies are using different scales, but some still rely on the ISO rating for homeowners insurance, commercial business fire insurance. And as we travel around, I've noticed in some of the statewide magazines is fire departments are now advertising their rating to attract more businesses that want to put a brick and mortar place within their city or county.
In their jurisdiction, yeah.
Is they will tote that, hey, we're a Class 1 fire department or Class 2, Class 3, and you can get breaks on your insurance based on our resources that we have to protect the different regions of the United States.
Right. And that all comes full circle, right? Because then if more businesses are built in their jurisdiction and region, they're paying more into taxes that then go to the fire service that allow them to provide better services. That's excellent. And it's interesting to me. I like that I'm hearing that those two organizations are kind of working together to kind of have some redundancy with those standards. Because as you mentioned, some of the things that ISO accreditation body was not doing, the NFPA was doing, and vice versa. So why not create a partnership there and maybe have some redundancy?
It wasn't always like that. One time the only thing the ISO was interested in when they came to town is, what your municipal water infrastructure looked like and your ability to put out a structure fire. Everything else was kind of fluff to them. Mm-hmm. Now they're looking at fire departments on a more global scale in the way that fire departments do business in a modern world today,
right,
which is a good thing.
Yeah, excellent. Absolutely. Okay, Mike, talk to me a little bit about the International Association of Fire Chiefs.
The IFC, and I was with the IFC for a number of years. The IFC is primarily a leadership organization within the fire service. You have to be a fire service chief officer to join.
Of course.
And so they're not a standard setting organization in the traditional sense that you think about organizations like the NFPA. They do set standards for their members. And those standards largely have to do with what's good for fire departments in their communities.
Okay.
And so it can fall into a number of different areas. And probably one of the best examples that both Jay and I have dealt with here very lately is the IFC released a document, and the title of that document was Emergency Vehicle Response Safety. Was that it, Jay?
I don't know.
Yeah, it was Emergency Vehicle Response something. I might have been safety. I don't remember the title of the document, but there were a lot of things in that document that were tied to how fire departments should operate vehicles in a safe manner.
Okay.
All the way from the way that fire apparatus is built to seatbelt usage to any one of a number of different areas. But one of the areas that they targeted very prominently in that document was red lights and siren response, recognizing when red lights and siren response is appropriate and maybe when it isn't appropriate, and the fact that a red lights and siren response should be tailored to the nature of the incident.
And that's something that we've been doing at the Academy for years.
A long time.
For
That's
years
right.
and years.
A long time,
Absolutely.
yes.
So I bet that was an exciting evolution there for us, right?
Yeah, and the IFC, sometimes to get something modern out of them can be a struggle because they've been around for a long time too. And when they came out with a document, we're going, yes. Yeah, it's just exactly what we needed them to say as a leadership organization in the fire service.
Right.
And that actually translates directly to what we do in the communication center directly. There really is no right turn there. It communicates directly with what we do in the communication center.
Okay. The other one I have on my list here is the International Association of Firefighters. How is that different from the IAFC?
Well, the IAAF, I kind of refer to them usually as the local or the international. It's a union.
Okay.
That's what it is. And so once again, it's not necessarily a standard setting organization like you think of in terms of the NFPA. Their primary goal is the health and safety, and primary goal is the health and safety of their members. Now, once again, that being said, what's good for the health and safety of their members many times translates to what is good for the fire department and then by extension, the community.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of one of the things that the IAAF is interested in, 4-person engine companies.
Mm-hmm.
Their belief is the safest thing for firefighters is to have adequate personnel on scene when they go to an incident. We agree 100% with that. However, when you talk about something like 4-person engine companies, it's a financial decision for most municipalities and most places, be it volunteer or be it paid fire departments. And so they have to make a decision whether they can fund to that level or not. The IAAF is always lobbying for things like that. And so I think by default, it makes them somewhat of a standard setting organization, but their standards that they look to put in place are very tightly controlled by the budget that a municipality has to spend on those things, like everything else.
Like all things, yeah.
Even the NFPA, I can tell you as a chief officer, I might be able to spend X amount of money to comply with this standard, and this standard. Over here, I'm not there yet because I don't have the budget available to me to do that. And so, the IAAF is kind of the labor union brother to the IAFC, let's say.
Sure.
Because they operate very much the same.
Okay.
But I'll tell you, the IAFF is a strong supporter of the Academy and its processes because of what we just spoke about, this red lights and siren response, what's safe. They fully recognize that one of our goals is to get good information so when firefighters are going to an incident, they know what they're going to.
Absolutely.
It's not a mystery. And so that's the safest thing for firefighters. And so they're all on board with something that's going to make firefighters safe.
Absolutely. So then talk to me a little bit about any quality assurance elements with either one of those organizations, because we talked about if you have a standard in place, it's really irrelevant if you're not doing any kind of quality assurance to see if it's being met. Are there quality assurance elements for either of those standard bodies as well?
Not to my knowledge that they have put in print that I know about, but the IFC will be the first one to tell you, retrospective incident review is pretty darn important.
Absolutely.
They may not call it quality assurance, but that's usually exactly what it is. There's
That's
a standard.
what they're doing. Yeah.
There are protocols and procedures that you have to adhere to, and if you don't, you have to go back and take a look and see what went wrong.
Right.
On a federal level, when a big incident happens in this country, I can tell you that 24 to 48 hours later, there is somebody over here on this side of the country that's taking a look at that, whether it be FEMA or the U.S. Fire Administration, say, what kind of lessons can we learn from this? I guarantee that it happened with that bridge collapse.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I think by proxy, that's a quality assurance piece.
Of course.
They just don't call it that.
Of course, right? After action, quality assurance,
Exactly.
Anything that takes a look at how did what we did work for us and
Or didn't
what
work.
can we change to do better next time? Absolutely. So what about the evolution of those organizations? Jay talked to us about how NFPA was, it got its inception back in the 1800s. Have these organizations been around that long as well?
The IAFF has, as a matter of fact, if you look at local numbers, union local numbers, the lower number they have, most of them over here on the East Coast, they'll have very low local numbers. Mm-hmm. And so that means they've been around a long time.
Yeah.
I can't tell you the exact date of inception, but they're pretty close. Now, the IFC is a little newer organization, and so it hasn't been around quite as long as IAFF has.
Okay. Jay, what about the United States Fire Administration, the USFA?
So the United States Fire Administration, they provide data, education, research, and support to the fire and emergency services organizations. And so they get data from reports from the fire departments. So we refer to that, the INFERS data reports that fire departments fill out. That all dumps into their main data center. It does take a while for them to produce data, but when they do, they can identify trends and things like that because, say, like back when the Dell computers caught on fire, so nobody would know that because, your computer caught on fire in Utah and his caught on fire in South Dakota and mine caught on fire in North Carolina. But how do we put all that together? As the fire reports start coming in, you can see, this make and model of an appliance or a computer or whatever could lead to a recall or something like that. And they also put together data that tells us how many people are injured or killed as a result of a fire. And so not just USFA, but NFPA is a big thing about lowering fire fatalities in the fire service. That's kind of all the way back to giving pre-arrival instructions as part of certification. And so we watch the USFA and see and pay attention to the data that they collect and the reports that they put out. And how can we make them fit into the fire protocol, or if a new proposal for change comes in, we now can now only look at the data from the U.S. Fire Administration, but now the International Academy of Emergency Fire Dispatch's data center as to what is relevant in making the next version of the protocol for EFD.
Excellent. So we're using that data to drive the evolution of changes in the future.
So many different factors now, not just the standards that you're talking about, that we've talked about here lately, but we also follow any other professional organization like the National Gas Association. We look to them for evacuation distances for gas leaks and things like that. So any of the fire organizations or any other professional organizations that can help our protocol be the best of the best is why we're out there doing the work that we do.
So speaking of the International Academies of Emergency Dispatch, talk to me about that one, Mike.
We're very much a proactive organization as opposed to a reactive organization. I can tell you that we don't sit around and wait for things to come to us. We go out and we actively seek them out.
Yep.
And Jay was just talking about the USFA. When we're creating process within a protocol, and I'll use structure fires as an example, one of the things that we've done and we do is the USFA, if there's a big fatality fire in this country, they, very shortly thereafter, they'll produce a report on it. And when I say very shortly, don't take that to mean days or weeks.
Sure.
Sometimes it takes a while. But they'll produce a report on it, and their reports are very good. They do computer modeling about exiting from buildings, ingress and egress from an area that's been burned up by a wildland event, hurricanes, you name it. Whenever there's been a big event, they will produce a report on it. They produced an excellent report after 9/11 about what went wrong, what went right, what could be done better in the future, all of those things. And I can tell you that we look at that data, those reports, when they come out. Okay, what did they find out when they went in and they correlated data on this incident? Some of the big fires in California, when we looked at those, the example that comes to mind right now is the Paradise Fire. And so I think it killed 80 some odd people, if I remember correctly. And so they produced a report on that fire, and it doesn't take long reading that report to get a sense of what happened.
Right.
One of the things that happened was people lived in that area, didn't believe that fire would burn to there.
Right.
Well, it turns out that fire footprint, there had been at least a dozen other fires burned in that same footprint that Paradise Fire burned in.
Wow.
So there had been many fires there.
Yeah.
People just didn't remember them. They didn't go back to recent memory. But, it was kind of a situation where people had one way in, one way out, and nothing had ever been done differently. And that memory, after a while, is lost.
Yep.
And so when we go to build our protocols, how we're going to tell people to exit a building, what we're going to tell them if a wildland fire burns into their neighborhood, where the only thing to burn is the houses themselves.
Right.
We go back and we look at that stuff and see what they found out and talk to our colleagues in the industry and say, how can we build a better mousetrap here so communications can help these folks, do what they need to do.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is obviously something that is very personal to me, right? Having lost my house in a wildfire a few years ago. The fact that our protocols saw a problem or a thing that was lacking in terms of the instructions in those after action reports about those fires. And we quickly made a change to make sure that that wouldn't happen again. And that is definitely one of my favorite stories about the evolution of our protocols at the Academy.
We took information from a number of resources. We even went to, our friends in Australia that have been, they've had awful bushfires over there with multiple fatalities. And we learned some lessons based on what they had learned about what to do if you're caught in a wildland event in a vehicle, what to do and what not to do based on their experiences. And so, we'll go anywhere in the world to glean that information to make our products and our processes better.
Yeah. I imagine the science of fire protocol must be a lot more challenging than something like medical, where you have one patient that has sort of one primary chief complaint, and we have lots of history and lots of science that tells us what's going to happen with that patient if we do X, Y, and Z. It seems to me, based on, again, personal experience, that fires don't really follow those rules, do they? We sometimes don't have any idea what's going to happen. We can certainly predict, but it's always good for us to have those backup instructions, right?
Oh yeah, I can tell you without a doubt, if you look through our fire protocols, that we take a top level view, global view of things, as opposed to this narrow view that you might have of one patient and one incident.
Yeah, absolutely.
We tend to look at things much more globally. Our traffic accident protocols are a really good example of that. In fire, we basically want to know what people see, not necessarily what their impression is about one specific patient at a time.
Absolutely.
I was discussing with someone today too about, and I guess it's just gotten kind of mundane almost, our trapped in the structure fire instructions. And a group came up and asked, why are some of the reasons, and the pre-arrivals are just as important, as our protocols, and I mentioned the trapped in the structure fire, and I said, do you even have instructions about, with the rise in cause of fire fatalities in the United States, I said, do you even have instructions to somebody that's trapped in a building fire? And they're like, no. And I said, well, that should be a gleaming reason why you would adopt the EFT protocols. And I told them we've had these trapped in structure fire instructions for so long. It's just come as mundane as giving CPR instructions in
Right.
medical.
You bet.
Is that we don't really talk much about trapped in structure fire and our building evacuations. It's just an everyday thing.
It's there. It's always there.
So, used to, and we're just going over the top of that with our new instructions and so forth.
So let's talk a little bit about why. So we talked about what these standards are. Now let's talk about why they are important to comm centers and specifically leadership in comm centers. Why do these standards matter to them?
Well, I'll go first. We're a little. I'll tell you that we're kind of biased in that regard because we know from long experience how structured call taking works.
Yeah.
We also know from long experience how non-structured call taking doesn't work.
Right.
No matter how people tend to argue the other direction. And what Jay just mentioned is probably the shining example of that kind of thing. You got agencies out there that have no idea what to do if somebody says, I'm trapped in the back room of my trailer house, it's on fire, what do I do?
Right.
So if you don't have a process and you don't have a protocol to deal with that, what's the alternative? Listen to them die on the phone?
Yeah. Too many times we hear stories about that.
Oh yeah, that's what an awful trade-off.
Yeah.
What an awful trade-off to have to make, And a lot of times it's a financially driven decision. It's a logistics driven decision for a communication center. If we had our way, everybody would have this thing everywhere.
Of course.
Because I know and we know that's the safest thing for people.
And it works.
Yeah, and it works, and it evolves in time as it should evolve.
Right.
Jay has got his finger on the pulse of what happens within 1225, inclusive of 1221 and 1061. As it changes, we will know that it changes, and we will change what we need to do to make that commensurate change. And so, like I said, we're very much so proactive and not reactive to things that happen out there.
Excellent. Yeah, and your example of the wildfire protocols and those instructions, prime example there. Getting someone that's trapped in a wildfire, telling them to jump into a body of water, right? Those kinds of things, because, again, with the lack of instructions, what else can we do? So we got to have something in place.
Jay and I were talking this morning about we have a brand new set of pre-arrival instructions for somebody that calls from inside a burning vehicle. If you'd asked me 10 years ago if somebody called from inside a burning vehicle and asked what to do, I'd have said, no way.
Open the door.
They'll just get out. Well, turns out that's not the truth.
That's right.
And so this kind of popped up as an emerging issue, so we went looking to see how prevalent this issue was, and you know what? It happens.
Yeah, I talked to an agency earlier today that had a call like that. The car rolled over, the person was trapped inside, and then it caught fire, and they could not get out. Yeah, and unfortunately, they didn't have any kind of protocols in place for that. So, those are horrible calls to listen to.
And so we're not just to, get out and be done. If somebody can't do A right, we'll send them to B. If that doesn't work, we'll send them to C. If that doesn't work, we'll send them to D. Eventually you're going to get to E and F. Yeah. Granted, but, we hope something in the middle there is going to catch.
Yeah. So Jay, being my implementations manager, what advice would you give to the listeners that are leadership at their communication center when it comes to these standards?
Just the things that we just talked about recently. The information to give to your telecommunicators to have at their fingertips, that they don't have to try to put into their memories. When you look at a communication center that's a primary communication center that does all three, they dispatch for police, EMS, and fire, we're the low call volume in the center. And so trying to remember what to say in a fire can be very difficult. A communication center can go an entire shift or week without even taking a fire call. And so when something as devastating as people trapped in a structure fire come in, it's terrible to being on the call taking end of that and not knowing what to say to that person when they tell you they're trapped in a structure fire or anything, the emerging electric vehicle thing and so forth. Another thing is our protocols have really stood the test of time. So anytime there's a firefighter fatality, NIOSH organization investigates. So that's the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And we've been included in a couple of those investigations in making sure that the telecommunicators that process those calls couldn't have done anything better to prevent the outcome of those tragedies. And in the investigations that we've been a part of, when they had our protocol, looked at our protocol, listened to the tapes and so forth, there were no major changes that organization came back to us to suggest.
No gaps.
Anything that has ever come back has been very minute, that it might have gotten put in on an additional information card, and that's it. Our key questions and instructions have been looked at by outside agencies twice now and found to be pretty rock solid. And so why would you not have a set of protocols that protect your staff and your center from that kind of liability and so forth? So
sometimes we have to do something different based on our experience too. Jay, tell them about that thing that the Railroad Association wanted us to do in terms of gathering a number for railroad crossing.
Yeah, and so we do get some different requests. The Railroad Association had started putting numbers on all of their crossings on the signs. And so we went out and looked at it, and I went out to a crossing and took some pictures. Well, we felt that the writing on the sign was so small that would put a caller in danger.
To get closer to see it,
Just the safety environment of the crossing, and if there was an accident, the railroad folks will always tell us that even though there's a collision involving a train, that doesn't mean the accident is over. That the load in those rail cars can shift hours or days later on top of somebody and so forth. And so, yeah, we will get proposals for change, and sometimes they're valid, and sometimes in the interest of public safety, caller safety, we have to take a pass on those.
Well, it's a good idea. Maybe it just needs to be explored a little further.
If it was 3 foot square, we'd have probably been a player.
Sure.
It helps them know exactly what crossing the malfunction is at. And so that's a benefit for them, but not so much somebody that wants to do something. So really, a good pair of binoculars would be your friend there. So.
All right, fellas. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I always learn something from both of you every time I have a conversation with you. I am just honored that you came and spent some time to share your knowledge and experience with me. Maybe we'll have you guys back again. What do you think?
You bet. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Tell Me Exactly to get the latest information on all things emergency communications. Tell Me Exactly is a Priority Dispatch Corporation podcast developed by our team of protocol experts and is hosted by me, Meridith Jensen, with Cody Ekman as producer, Reading Roberts as sound engineer, Scott Robinson and Jason Barber as executive producers.